In a previous video, we talked about reading a textbook line by line and take copious notes. Today, we'll explore a different strategy, which is to quickly read the whole source, taking only quick jots as we read to map the domain. In this strategy, we just accept that we are new to the domain, so we cannot really judge what is relevant or important yet. Instead, our goal is to first quickly read through the whole material so we can get an overview of the area. And then we decide what is worth or relevant to have a more deeper dive in that specific part of the material. And all that while trying to avoid the trap or forgetting everything that we have read before we are able to take the decision what's important or relevant to dive deeper into. And that's why we take notes, okay? Because if you don't take notes, after reading the whole text, especially a textbook, which tends to be long, which tends to be very heavy text, will not remember anything if you don't take notes. But even for people who take notes, they may still fall on the same trap. They may still forget what they read, even with the notes in front of them. And the main reason is because they take 3 different types of notes. And the first one are poor actual reminders. These are basically to-do items disguised as notes. And their purpose is for us to delay sense making. So we read now, but we defer making sense of what the authors try to say to later. If ever, because later, in total honesty, never arrives. And these often sound like this. I don't understand. Or is this credible? What does it mean? Or seems related to X, whatever X is. Not sure. Does this contradict the earlier point? But we don't investigate further that question. Explore this more later. Or think more about this. Or confusing. Another type of note are generic source indices. And these are vague labels about the type of content you can find in the source. And they are so generic that they could apply to actually any source. They are things like definition, or example, method, finding, theory. Some people like to write those specific words in the marginalia of the text, maybe put some post-its, or even use color-coded highlights to represent each one of those categories rather than quick jotting those words. And then the third type of notes that people take are the thought reminders. These capture a reminder of a fleeting thought that passed while we were reading, or any personal association that we made while reading the source. And they may look like this: interesting, or good for project X, similar to source Y, seems important, doesn't sound like a good idea, or reminds me of W. And this can be 1 or 2 sentences long, and the main issue is that they don't provide enough context to be useful later. Because they remind you that you had a thought, but they didn't really unpack the thought you had at a specific moment. They don't explain what the thought really was. Now, why are these a problem? The problem is, by the time you finish reading, we have the feeling that we understood the source. It's like, okay, I got it. But when it's actually time to act on the source, whether to write it, or explain it to someone else, or decide what you should be diving deeper into, you realize that the details themselves are a little bit fuzzy. And that's the moment when you start second guessing everything that you read. Do you really understand that? I'm not sure, let me go back to the source again. We're never sure that we know what we just read. For example, in the action reminder, we never actually made sense of that piece of information. We left it for later. And then we start asking, should we have understood it? Is it okay to skip this part? So we end up thinking, well, let me just reread this part again to make sense of what the author was trying to say. And then I can decide if it's important or not. And then before we know it, we are rereading the whole source again, without even knowing if that's actually relevant for what you want to do. And that's the action reminder. Now, what if I'm reading a generic source index? Okay, nice. You have found 60 definitions, 800 examples, and 12 methods. So what? Are they all relevant? Which one of them really matter? You are now left with 872 items to make sense of it, decide which one really matters. So now you need to reread everything to figure that out. And the last one is reading the thought reminder. And we say, this is the important one. These were actually my thoughts, what I understood from the source. So let's go back to them again. And the fact is, a lot of time has passed. We're talking about a textbook. You have read the whole thing, and now you're trying to read those things again. And the fact is, the fleeting thought that passes in our minds for like 10 seconds is now gone, okay? And what usually happens is at this moment, we just look at our notes and when we are asking ourselves, what was I trying to say here? So after all that reading, all that notes taking, we are left with two options and none of them are good, okay? The first one is to end up ignoring all your notes, ignoring all highlights, and relying just on your memory to try to remember what is important or relevant and is worth to diving deeper into it. Or the second option is actually reading the whole source again to try to figure that out. So how can you actually solve the problem so we don't face this situation, okay? And first, it's important to remember that reading the whole source very quickly and just take quick jots is actually not the problem. The problem is how we take notes while reading. It's what goes into those quick jots. So here's what I recommend. Stop and take a quick jot only when you find something that is either interesting, relevant, or puzzling. And as time is of essence, just leave your notes to 1 or 2 sentences only, but make them actually useful. So let's see how we can take the same types of notes, but making them work for us at the end of the process. So first, the actual reminders when you find something puzzling. If you don't understand something, don't just brush it off. Instead, take 1 minute, literally 1 minute, to make sense of that confusion. You can ask yourself, I don't understand, and then explain what's the thing that you don't understand. Explain your words, okay? Or, I think the author means, and you say, because of something else. For example, I don't understand what the author means by tacit knowledge. I think it's something people know but can't put into words, like riding a bike. And that's it, really. Because the simple act of writing down your confusion primes your mind to answer that question as you keep reading the source. So you'll find the answer maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs or a few pages later, and then you can come back and just write down what's the answer to your confusion. So by the end of the source, you have fewer open loops to make sense of at the end of everything. So the next are the source indices, or finding something relevant. So instead of tagging just like definition or example, I invite you to go one step forward. What is the author saying? Or summarize the takeaway in your own words, for example. If it's relevant now, why is it relevant and relevant for what? For example, this defines bounded rationality as decision making limited by available information and time, useful for my section cognitive limits. So by the end of the source, you can judge what is relevant to dive deeper into just by looking at your notes, because your notes are telling what it's relevant for. And then the third one are the thought expression, when you find something interesting. So if something sparked a thought on you, don't just say, oh, that's interesting, and then move on. Instead, write it out. Do you agree, disagree, see a connection, or remember an experience? Then capture your thoughts in 2 or 3 sentences as if you were explaining it to your future self, who will probably have no memory of it. For example, this reminds me of how I struggled to teach statistics to non-math students. Maybe I was trying to teach procedural fluency before conceptual grounding. So unpack your thoughts just enough so that you don't need to remember them later. Instead, you can just read them. Anytime we take quick jot notes, we need to make sense of them anyway. The main difference here is that in one case, you leave to the very end to make sense of all your notes, so you may end up having to reread everything, whereas in the other way, you are making sense of the thought at the time of the reading, while the reading and the thought that just came to mind are still fresh in your mind. You still know what you're trying to talk about. Because you just read the paragraph, you just had the thought. So that is the best time of writing it down. So if you want to take notes of a textbook while reading quickly and without forgetting everything, make sure to unpack your thoughts just enough so that you understand them later. And your future self will certainly thank you. I hope today's strategy was useful, so let me know in the comments what you think about this video and what you'd like to see next. And I see you in the next video.